Hey, listen, welcome everybody. It's nice to see new faces, and thanks for coming out. We really appreciate it. Just so you know, this group meets monthly, and I moved back to Florence about 2.5, 3 years ago, and it just was an amazing group. Even in the middle of COVID, we were still meeting, and it was just nice to find like-minded people interested in military history, and so it's been a nice group for me. So the challenge with speaking to a group like this is that most of these guys know much more about the subject of local history and Civil War in general than I do. And so I am used to speaking to audiences around, like I do a lot of rotaries, I do a lot of things like that. Oh yeah, that's fine. I look better in the dark, so the darker the better. But it's a challenge to speak to people with great knowledge. Lanny just spoke on an engagement that was, 4 or 5 miles from here. Little Bear Creek, that was unbelievable. I had ancestors in that battle. Most of it was fought up along Willingham Road, and that's one of my names is Willingham. So it's just always interesting to me to see the knowledge that we have. So I've had to change everything. So this is like a whole brand new presentation. And what I thought I would do is really talk about my personal journey in this. As you can tell by my war game up here and the paintings and writing books and things like that, I wear a lot of hats. And as I go forth into my master's program, I wanted to kind of give y'all some background because unfortunately you guys are going to have to kind of go through this master's program with me. As I take a class, there's nothing like teaching it after you've done it or learned it to solidify it. So without further ado, I'll kind of dive right in. I broke it down. I promise I'm not going to kill you with I've got my timer on, so brevity is the best way to do it. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got here. I'm going to talk about Confederate Winter, my first book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the next phase of the journey, which is veterans work and with the American Legion. A little bit about Freedom Spring, a little bit about the historical art, and then touch briefly on the master's program that I'm in. So there's a lot on here, but ultimately this is it. I love this picture. Larry David, everybody knows Larry David. An avid history buff, Larry David took his daughter to every Civil War battlefield everywhere. And you can see his daughter's face. That was my life. I don't know why I have a gene that makes me interested in military history. I don't know. My cousins can rattle off every baseball statistic known to man. That's not me. I can't do it. But if you ask me about a dead guy from the 1800s, I probably know him. It's weird. But that journey has led me to some interesting places that I'm kind of proud of. So I'm from Sheffield. I moved back here about 2.5 years ago. I left when I was about 5, but I thought this was an interesting slide. I was doing one of the best genealogy libraries in the country is in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I lived for 35 years in Indianapolis. And so I found a document in a book that showed a group of my ancestors that came to North Alabama, and here was the basic story. They were indentured servants in New Bern, North Carolina, and they got their freedom. They turned their houses into wagons. They took those wagons over to the Tennessee River around Chattanooga, Knoxville. They turned those wagons into boats or rafts. They floated down to the end of navigation, which was Muscle Shoals. The Indians had really kind of just been pushed out at that point. They landed around Tuscumbia, and they turned the wagons back in, or the boats back into wagons, and then took them out to Jackson Mountain, out towards Willingham Road, out 72 West, and that's where they settled. So, and then they turned those same boats back into houses. It really is intriguing to me to think that there might be wood that made that journey. As a quick aside, my ex-in-laws used to live in New Bern, and I was eating barbecue in New Bern, North Carolina one time, and it tastes just like Singleton's barbecue. And I thought, what in the world? I've never come across a place that has barbecue just like we have in North Alabama. I think that's why. So at 5, my dad took a job with NASA. So as a little kid, I grew up in Cape Canaveral and watched all the Apollo launches. Now, what I tell Dad, he'll be buried with NASA patches on his tombstone. I think after we're dead and gone, 1,000 years from now, no one will even hardly remember the American Civil War, but they will remember the fact that man left the planet. That to me is pretty neat. So it's nice to know my dad had a little bit of history in that. So this is a couple of really handsome devils, okay? So this is the stock I come from. These are a couple of my triple great-grandfathers. I wrote this narrative about the guy up in the top from Amory, Mississippi. He couldn't read or write. The documents I have on all these guys are signed with X's. So, but I've got stories of him at the Bloody Pond. Or the guy on the bottom is the actual guy who I wrote Confederate Winter about. And his story, which I'll talk about a little bit later, was that he got drafted up into the Confederate Army at the age of 14. Now think about that if you got grandkids. He got drafted in, pulled into the war, and the document I have says that he left and was in the big battle at Franklin and came home in rags. So those are just things that I knew, and I decided that kind of early in my teens that the service was the place for me. I had gone through all these stories. I had a long tradition of people in my family serving. So I decided I was a Civil War reenactor, but I was a Civil War reenactor because the guys in my tank unit in Aniana were all Civil War reenactors. So my college career, when I was not doing things I shouldn't have been doing, was 1 week in a month I was on a tank, and then I went active duty, joined the Army to see the world, and they sent me to Louisiana. It looks just the same. Yep. But what it did was give me a kind of a juxtaposition that allowed me to write. And living on that tank with these guys in, we were in the Reagan era, so I was in the field 300 days a year. And it allowed me to understand soldiers, understand what it was like to eat sea rations all the time, sleep outside in rain and weather, and I felt like it allowed me to pursue a career in writing. So this has kind of been my journey here. Family's here. I grew up really in Birmingham. After NASA shut the program down, Dad ended up in Birmingham. He was the head of Social Security, and he had George Wallace's file and all those guys, Elvis. And then after Louisiana, I ended up settling in Indiana. And so I just ran up and down 65 all the time. And you'll find that most of my work, most of my writing is kind of about that corridor. So that's my 3 kids. I was, and still am, I was an on-the-road salesman, selling medical equipment forever. Still do it. But if you've ever been a salesman and you live in the hotels, what you rapidly learn is you've got one of a couple of directions. You can end up at the bar all night and become an alcoholic, and I got a lot of friends that aren't with us today because that's the side of the journey they took. What I decided to do was sit in that hotel room and write, and books came out the other side. And my drinking problem is still moderately under control. That's my 3 kids, and so I don't know what y'all's experience is, but my kids are in their 30s now, and none of them gives a flip about history. And I was competing with that guy. My nemesis, Harry Potter. That's all they wanted to read. If it didn't have dragons or witches or something fantasy, and it just drove me crazy. So the first book I wrote was really as a counterbalance, trying to get them to, the stories and myths that we grew up with were just not getting told. And so that's what I was writing for, was to find that, to get that kind of information. So Confederate Winter is the first book, and that's what I recommend people start the series with. It came from that. And I love this quote. So like Lanny and Joel, Greg Gresham, who's not here, these guys, they're historians. They know details. I can't remember anybody's names. Dates slip through my mind, but I like telling stories. And so what I felt like my role was to tell the story, what it felt like to be there. And so that quote by E.L. Doctorow is really kind of my guidepost. I want to tell you not what happened, I want to tell you what it felt like. And I'll tell you, as a writer sitting in the Red Roof Inn in Gary, Indiana, writing this stuff, I would live it. I mean, the sweat would pour off of me writing some of these scenes. So that's the first book. That's the second. And I launched this book on the week of June 17th, 2015. Anybody know what happened the week of June 17th, 2015? That knucklehead came on the scene. My book was banned on Amazon because it had the word Confederate in it for the first 2 weeks. But I understand it because I grew up in the Old South. I used to sing Dixie in the officers club with all the other officers from the South. We would take over the end of the bar. I flew a Confederate flag off my tank as I ran on maneuvers through Germany. I was in a unit that was a descendant from a Confederate cavalry unit. I was born in 1961, 100 years after the anniversary of the Civil War, and I watched this knucklehead change the world in that. And whether we like it or not, anybody that's interested in Civil War information or study now is a little bit at the mercy of this. And so part of the journey that I'm on, I'll talk about here in a little bit, is coming to grips with these things. How do you deal with this passionate subject that is passionate across, would you have this? So off I go, and I'm out. They finally put my book on. I'm a conciliatory guy. When I die, I hope people say he was a nice guy to everybody. That's what I want to be known as. So I went out and got on the book speaking circuit, mostly around Indiana where I lived, and I'm teaching. Now Indiana was a lot of men were lost from Indiana down here. Okay, they're buried all over these hills. But in Indiana, they don't know a lot about their history. So I spent a lot of time talking to them and talking to groups about the Western theater of the Civil War. Their ancestors fought in it, but they don't know a great deal about it. Now, there are groups like us that are quite detailed and know quite a bit. But I felt like that was kind of my mission, was to say to the groups I spoke to, people did things, really important things throughout history, and it's important to know them. So I was hesitant to put these slides in because the people that are normal regulars at the Civil War Roundtable know all this, but I'm going to, for y'all that don't, let me set up the scenario of Confederate Winter for you, okay? So everything happened in the Western theater in my books. At this point in the war, Sherman has not yet started his march. He's really working his way down and taking Atlanta, okay? And General Hood is who he's opposite with. That's the Confederate commander. Most of the Mississippi River, all the Mississippi River has been taken. The Unions control Pensacola, and Grant is in the epic battles around Richmond against Lee. So when Atlanta falls, Hood's small army says, what are we going to do? How do we counter this? And the idea he had was, first, I'll come up and break their line. Secondly, that didn't work. He didn't even have enough men to fight the rear guard of Sherman's army. The second idea was to come up here around the shoals and then push up to a smaller army defending Nashville. This is where my ancestors, and probably some of yours, got caught up in this. Now, let me put a caveat on that. Some of my people were from southern Tennessee. I had ancestors that fought for the North also. This was a very, very divided area. Probably this area was, I would say, went kicking and screaming into the Confederacy. Now, once the Lincoln called up the troops, you got on board or you got out of Dodge. But there were a lot of people with mixed sympathies in here. So here we are down here. Mom and Dad lived on Dunnigan Slough right out here, and on that road is Bainbridge Crossing, which that first painting is about Bainbridge Crossing. That's where Hood crossed. It was actually pretty daring to think about getting up this road. Nashville at the time was, I would argue, probably the most heavily defended, most fortified city in the country. That ring of forts still exists around Nashville. We'll talk about that in a minute. Pretty interesting. And he fought several battles, Spring Hill, which figures prominently in the book. I won't tell you too much about it because I want you to read the book. Spring Hill factors in there. The Battle of Franklin, which is an incredibly well done site that 20 years ago was not. Right. And then the Battle of Nashville, which has pretty much been taken over by urban development in Nashville. There's still a couple of sites, and I'm going to give you a suggestion on one of them. But those three battles dictated the trajectory of a lot of my family's life. I'm going to talk a little bit about battlefield restoration because that's always been a very passionate subject for me. I have stomped, as I showed on that early slide, I've stomped around Civil War battlefields, mostly Shiloh, but I've been to almost every one of them now. What was happening as I'm working my way around in the business world, I'm watching this amazing group of people take Franklin, Tennessee, and begin to convert the battlefield to its historical look and interpretation on the sites in Franklin. I love this one. That's a Chinese restaurant that was at Opdyke's Charge that was just a travesty to me to think the hallowed ground that those men died on is a Chinese restaurant in a parking lot. And they, in many ways, set the standard for battlefield restoration. Them and then American Battlefield Trust has also been very instrumental. I always used, whenever I would travel the South, I would take pictures of Indiana monuments to speak to the folks up there that really didn't understand what all was down here. A lot of Indiana monuments around. And technology, I put this slide in because technology is going to change things. It already is. So this is a Civil War photograph that, I don't know, Brady or one of his minions took. And a team of researchers was able to identify this location at the Manassas battlefield. They were able to identify those initials right here on this wooden tombstone. They were able to identify that soldier and excavate about 5 feet off the parking lot of the Manassas Visitor Center and find that guy. Wow. And reinter him with an appropriate marking on his grave. So the reason I show you that is that I've got a lot of friends that are metal detectors, and I was a metal detector. But the technology we have today, we don't know what that technology is going to be like 30 years from now. Ground penetrating radar, things like that, ideas that we don't even know about can give us the history of these battlefields, and we just, like I say, we don't know what we don't know right now. And so that's why battlefield restoration is important, because there is a story to tell in that. All right, so I've written a book. I'm out on the speaking circuit. I'm a pretty darn good medical salesman, but nobody thinks of me as a medical salesman. I'm a guy that wrote a book, which is hilarious to me, if they only knew. But I got involved in Veterans Affairs, and this goes somewhere. It's a quick departure. I was informed one day, I was never real active in that community, and I was informed that our 100-year-old Legion post in Greenfield, Indiana was closing. And I just said, it can't happen. That organization can't close. This is a past commander, that's a World War II guy. So I took a departure and decided to get involved in the Legion post. Well, I'm a big believer in that for you to have fulfillment in life, you have to have a mission. And that was the problem with our Legion post, is we didn't have a mission. We lost our bar. Nobody was playing bingo anymore. And that didn't appeal to me anyway. But I realized, this would have been in 2016, 2017, what I realized is that our Vietnam dead in that county, 13 of them, I think that's right, the 50th anniversary was coming up. And I realized that there were sons and daughters and brothers and sisters of those 13 men in that community who had never had much of anything in ceremony around their loved one who had died fighting for us. And so I kind of made that the mission of our Legion. And on the exact day, rain or shine, we did them in the snow, we did them in pouring rain, but there was an honor guard and a bugler, and families would come to that. There were tears. It moved me, and it moved a lot of people in that. And because after 50 years, they're gone, and so I met some amazing people. But what it did for me was make me appreciate the American soldier. I know what it's like to be out there. Listen, I got a 10% discount at Red Lobster today. Thank y'all very much. But the guys that pay the ultimate sacrifice, their families don't get a lot. We really don't as a society. We kind of bypass them. So the bottom line, though, is that mission turned that Legion post around. From getting 2 people at a meeting, and their conversation was to shut it down, this was what it was like when we left. Robust. They do amazing things now. But what it did was, there are signposts along your life. And it was a signpost for me for something that I never thought about. So I came down to Florence, Alabama. Now remember, I'm living in Indiana. I come down to Florence. My mom and dad live in Muscle Shoals. And I got to be the speaker at the Learning in Retirement conversation at UNA. And I thought I was hot stuff. And Mom was in the crowd and Dad, and I got to be a speaker and put my coat on and do all that stuff. But the lady that spoke after me blew my mind. Her name's Peggy Towns. Her book is Duty Driven. She is an amazing woman. And what I learned was that from up here, I just always assumed that everybody down here fought for the South. And what I learned is that her ancestor was a slave, joined the Union Army, 180,000 of them did, and fought for the North. And the narrative that there were these guys down here that got the worst places to camp, the worst food, the worst equipment. Mostly what they did was the grunt work, but they still showed up. They were American soldiers. They raised their right hand and they took the oath of allegiance. And that just blew my mind. And I said, I was searching, trying to find what that next book was. And once again, historian, novelist. I wanted to tell the story of that. Now that was tough to take me and step into the life of a young African American in the South, stepping into the ranks of the United States Army. But you'll have to read Freedom Spring and tell me if I did it okay. But this is what really blew me away. This was from the Civil War Battlefield Trust. This is the number of African American troops that were killed in the war. I didn't know that. I had no idea. Now you'll look at battlefield deaths versus, everybody that studies the Civil War knows that you pack a lot of men together before antibiotics, dysentery and bad food and consumption and all those things that killed them in droves. Droves. But what really got me was that Peggy's ancestor's story was that he was a United States soldier in Athens, Alabama at Fort Henderson, which you can go to right now, is still a fort. The earthworks are still there. He was captured, put back into bondage, sent down to Fort Blakely in Mobile, and reinterred as a slave and built the fortifications that eventually culminated in the largest charge of African American soldiers in the country attacking those fortifications. Well, that to me was just a phenomenal story. So here's Fort Henderson. Fort Negley, if you ever go to Nashville, go to Fort Negley. It's the best view of downtown Nashville. It's a restored fort, but as the slaves escaped and moved north, where they went for safety, and think about this. I mean, you think about Gaza right now. You're getting the heck out of Dodge. You don't want to be with your family in a war zone. Where do you go? You go to the safest place you possibly can, and that was underneath the big guns at Fort Negley. Fort Negley factors in, and then Fort Blakely. Anybody been to Fort Blakely? Oh, yeah. So Fort Blakely is an amazing site down by Mobile. Well, Donna's sister, my wife's out here, Donna's sister and her husband live on the battlefield of Fort Blakely. I was an offensive guard. That guy was my offensive tackle. He is one of the experts on the Battle of Fort Blakely. What in the world were the odds of that? So I'm down there researching and studying it. I reached out to Barry on Facebook, said, hey man, let's have breakfast. I'm over at Fort Blakely doing research on a book. It was awesome. So I've stomped all around those entrenchments and those earthworks quite a bit. But it was really kind of one of those signposts. Now, along this journey, I started painting. I was too stressed at work. Donna said, let's get you out of Dodge. She took me up to a little place to go camp or go do art. And I started picking up the paintbrush and painting again. So that's kind of my interpretation of what Fort Henderson looks like. This story factors in, Barry found this coming out of a draw. Now, if you've ever hunted Civil War relics, these are what are called dropped balls. So what's typically happened is they're in a guy's pocket or he's holding them in his hand. He's running with his rifle, okay, and keeps those at the ready, not in his cartridge box, so he can fire, immediately tear off a cartridge, slide it in, ramrod down. Well, that canister right there shot out of a cannon probably killed the man that was carrying those 3 shots. Now, this would have been an African American soldier because we were studying along that line of the battlefield. So there was something, especially with the mindset that I was in those days, I still am of that mindset, to know that I'm standing in a place that a man gave his life and to see the actual in the ground piece that killed him was very moving. It actually, I say Freedom Spring in a lot of ways wrote itself. It was a lot of work, but it really, in a lot of ways, was a story that kind of came to me. So what you'll get when you get Freedom Spring is the journey all the way down to Mobile. Once again, that if you think about that I-65 line, I can't get away from I-65. So I don't know what I'm going to write next, but so I've always, as I've gone through this journey, I get some passes. I'm a veteran. I'm interested in Civil War history. I've written about white soldiers and black soldiers. I'm probably the only guy you know that has done book signings in Beauvoir, Jefferson Davis's home, and the next week did book signings at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. That's an interesting place in the year 2023 to be, and I love it because my job is to try to be, I'm a guy who looks for common ground. Everything I do is to try to bring people together. And I will do that till the day I die. I'm very proud of the fact that African American or whoever visits, and if you hadn't been to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, you owe it to yourself to go see. It's unbelievable. And I lived in Birmingham, grew up in Birmingham, was in busing. I mean, we lived it. Now this goes back to battlefield restoration. That's a gun emplacement at Fort Blakely that I drove by on a Sunday, and on Monday, that's the same gun emplacement, bulldozed for a subdivision. Wow. And so the protection of those things is really important. And that leads me to this picture on the left. This is, Fort McDermott, I think. I can't see what I mean. I'll never make it as a history professor. But this is an amazing fort at Spanish Fort. And the Sons of Confederate Veterans have done an amazing job restoring that. They've done a lot of the work at Fort Blakely. But this is an area that I'm concerned, because of that picture of Dylan Roof we saw earlier, that unless we figure out a way to bring people together, these symbols are going to be a little problematic when our generation is dead. So part of what I'm looking for in my public history degree is, how do we bridge this gap? And I don't have any answers yet. But I'm trying to figure out if I'm a guy that has a message in that. I don't know. I know one thing. I want that fort to be preserved for the next generations, as do everybody that I talk to. So some of what we're doing, Fort Blakely, where Barry and I used to go and crawl over the earthworks, is now the African American Civil War Heritage Trail. That did not exist 6 years ago, 7 years ago. That's new. If you haven't been to Athens to go see what's the name of that? The Veterans Museum. That Veterans Museum is incredible. It's 45 minutes from here. They put together an amazing exhibit on the African American soldiers. So that to me is part of the bridging that we have to do to get that story told. My hope is that that we'll have African American folks from the community in this group someday, because their heritage in this, they got a story to tell in it. We'll see. Huntsville's got the Buffalo Soldier Monument. So we're starting to see that kind of stuff. All right, so I'm going to shift gears and get off my soapbox a little bit, but I have really kind of started taking my art and try to do more with it. So this is Fort Gaines. This is a buddy of mine, a howitzer battery that I painted from a picture he had. That's a Civil War reenactor that I saw at Shiloh. I do this, I like painting historical paintings. It's interesting to me. And then this I did, when I moved, I paint. This is right after Ukraine got invaded. That's hanging in Washington, D.C. right now. A buddy of mine bought it. And this, thanks to these knuckleheads in here, I'm just rolling along, minding my own business, and they start kind of roping me into doing paintings. So this is the most, to that point, I painted this summer. You're witnessing, this is brand new. I'm no fancy artist. But there's a story about the two gunboats. This is the Ferry and the Reindeer. And this is Bainbridge Crossing. Dunnigan Slough would be right here. I'm about at the Indian Springs neighborhood right here, if that rings a bell. So this is all houses. And the road bends down. Yep, we're on the Lauderdale County side looking south. There's no dam in the river at this point. But after that disastrous campaign, the Confederates retreated to safety, and safety meant to get across that river. So they were hustling to get across that river as fast as they could. This is December. It's cold. It's miserable. They're starving to death. Their supplies have been left along the road. They've had massive casualties. And now, this is a great story that Greg Gresham's going to write in a book one of these days about this pontoon bridge that they cobbled together to get across the river to safety that was by the skin of their teeth. And up these two gunboats come the day after Christmas, shelling that bridge to try to break it and trap these men up here. If they had succeeded, this would be a place like Vicksburg right now. We would have entrenchments all over the place. There would be, everybody would know this area because we would have had 30,000 men trapped here. But this 4 battery of cannon on a bluff fought off these 2 ships. And they sent them back down the river, down to Florence. So that scene has never been illustrated before. And that's the very first illustration that we have of that. So eventually this will hopefully go on a marker or a kiosk somewhere on the Lauderdale side. So anyway, I'm trying. I'll put it that way.
Great job.
This is Joel's Byler Road project. So I'll slaughter the details of this, but I'll call it the first interstate highway cutting down through Alabama was the Byler Road. Started at Bainbridge Crossing, went from trading post to tavern to working its way down to Tuscaloosa. So this is Tuscaloosa in about, 1815 is that?
1827.
1827. There's the Capitol being built. This is the river, the Black Warrior River, that goes down to Mobile. And kind of like Muscle Shoals, this 5, 6, 8 foot falls ended navigation. You couldn't get on up to Selma and to Montgomery. All you could get to was to Tuscaloosa. Again, this is not something that's ever been painted before. Hopefully this will go in. This tavern is still there. It's been relocated. But that tavern hopefully will have this in and it'll be on a kiosk. So Joel is taking this road and putting markers through the state from Bainbridge Crossing all the way down to Tuscaloosa. That's a great story. People will ride their bikes. That's how you build these bike trails. That's how you build tourism, is people want to follow these things. So lastly is Masters of Public History. I started this semester. My goal in retirement 3 or 4 years from now is to work at Pope's Tavern. It's about 3 doors down from my house. And when I'm old, I can make it to Pope's Tavern, I think, even on my scooter. And so that's the plan for old Kurt, is to be able to get down there and try to stay relevant, try to keep talking. So I'm learning. And the reason I mention that is because this group is my people. The people that like military history and history, I feel like I can come and talk to you guys, and I appreciate you. And I learn a lot. And what I'm hoping is I go through this master's program, that y'all let me periodically get up here and kind of tell you what I've learned, tell you what I'm working on, and solicit your advice and your support, and try to figure out some way to kind of navigate the next 20 years of my life if I get lucky to get that.